This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, a leading international professional body advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Felicity Dwyer. I'm a coach, facilitator, trainer, and author of Crafting Connection. In this series, I'm delighted to introduce you to coaches and educators who bring their expert and varied perspectives to the theme of working with the whole person in coaching. We'll explore psychological frameworks and practical approaches that can help you increase your impact as a coach. I'm really delighted on this episode to be welcoming Rachel Blackman as our guest. This episode's on somatic coaching. And Rachel is a somatic coach. She's also a trainer, a mentor, a theatre maker, an improviser, and a Feldenkrais practitioner. And Rachel not only runs a one-to-one coaching practice, but she teaches and trains coaches to work with embodied intelligence at the Somatic School. And she's on the product development team at the school. And her areas of interest and specialism include creativity, embodied intelligence, and supporting change in our clients at the level of neuroplasticity. So that's really deep and lasting change. Rachel has a fascinating background. She trained and worked as an actor in Australia before relocating to England. And you may remember her as Shara in The Matrix Revolutions. So, Rachel, I love that you draw on the influences of theatre making and somatic education in developing many of the tools that you've come up with or that have emerged for you in the body-oriented coaching context. And this developing body of work is called integrative somatic feedback. And before we move into our conversation, Rachel, is there anything more that you would like to add about yourself for listeners so they understand you and your work and where this conversation is emerging from?
Hello. Thank you for having me today. It feels like a real honour to be here. It's really interesting hearing one's biography back, isn't it? Because it's a very strange perspective, hearing about yourself in the third person. Something I guess I might like to add is that from the outside, a lot of those things can look like different professions, but from the inside, they feel very woven in together and related. And I think that's an interesting thing. And we might get into that a little bit, I guess, at some point. I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's a real honour to be here. I'm delighted to come. I just love to spread the word about embodied intelligence wherever I can.
That's wonderful. Well, you're so welcome. And I love what you said about, it feels like it's all woven together inside, because that really chimes with our theme of integration as well. And how we can integrate different aspects of ourselves and our experience in who we are as coaches and, as people. Okay, let's dive into the topic of somatic coaching. An opening question for anyone who's not familiar with this: what is somatic coaching?
That's such a great question to start with. So we might think of coaching traditionally sitting in the realm of the coachee being the thinker or the reflector, one who is thinking or reflecting. And in somatic coaching, we're inviting a more whole self in the coachee. So the client is invited into feeling, sensing, perceiving. They're invited into what we might call their felt sense. The sensations are welcome, but also the relational field. So they're also invited to work in an exploratory way with the environment they're in. They might get up off their chair and move. We might be very curious as a coach about what is arriving in our felt sense as we're with the client. And that might be something that we're feeding into our perception of the third shared space. That's a little starter for 10. We're inviting cognition in as an aspect of being in the body. So cognition is welcome, and cognition is not separate to being in an embodied experience. So we all are in this condition of being in a body because we're alive. Yeah. We can't avoid it. So we're all born into this condition of being in a body, and cognition is just one way of paying attention. So there are lots of other ways of offering our attention, and cognition is just one of them. And so in somatic coaching, we're really curious about cognition, but also all the other ways we can pay attention.
So it brings that curiosity into so many other areas, into the client's felt sense and the way they interact with the environment, but also paying attention to what's happening in our bodies.
Yeah, that was a much more succinct way of saying it than I just did.
This is my role in summarising. Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. I guess the next question really links is, why is it so valuable? Why do you think it's important? Clearly, this is something that you've devoted a lot of your time and energy to. It's your area of specialism. So why do you think it's important for coaches, or coaches might get curious about why they might want to bring in the body, the wider understanding of cognition, their own sensations? Why does it matter?
Well, in a coaching container, we're inviting in a relational field. We're sitting in a relational field with each other. I am with you and we are in presence with each other, and I'm supporting you to come into presence with your material as the coachee. And as a Western person, as a white Western person, I might have had a lot of experience as a sort of person walking around in the Western world of thinking of my body as just something that I've got, like a transportation device for my brain. A friend of mine said to me once, well, I've got to, what's all this embodiment stuff? He said, because I've got to take my body to the pub with me, because how else do I get there? This idea of relating to the embodied experience as a sort of neck down experience and a kind of a function rather than a territory of intelligence feels to me like a coming home and a deepening. Most of the coaches I know are really interested in that, how we might invite in a sense of coming home and deepening into.
Yeah.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a fascinating area. And the idea to me that our brains, which are, that they are part of our bodies and they are intimately linked through our nervous system with everything else, without our bodies, what is our brain? I mean, that's probably more of a philosophical question than the practical ones we're talking about today. But I just find that whole thing fascinating. And I know that you've talked a little bit about embodied intelligence, and you talked there about the territory of intelligence and, getting that sense of the whole body being a landscape and different parts of it useful to explore, like the explorer metaphor. So could you say a little bit more about your understanding of embodied intelligence and how body helps our thinking, how cognition, embodied intelligence and embodied cognition, I think. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what is that?
Well, what's coming up into my mind as we're speaking is an exercise that we offer the students at the Somatic School by way of supporting them to understand how embodied imagination is. It's a very simple experiment, and you can kind of do it with all. I've not met anyone for whom it doesn't have some resonance for. It's taught in a wider context, but I think it's okay to sort of take it out here. I'm going to invite you for a moment, if you follow me,
I'd love to.
Just take a little moment to bring yourself into presence, just mindfulness, whatever that means for you. And now inviting you to imagine biting into a fresh lemon. Imagine the experience of biting into a fresh lemon. And notice what, if anything, happens in your saliva glands. Notice what, if anything, happens in your experience. What's that like?
Yeah.
And it will be subtly different for everybody, but most people have a physical response, like a physiological response. And then if you palate cleanse that one for a moment and come back into mindfulness again, just let that one leave the room if you like. And I'll invite in another one. So inviting you to imagine that you have been, let's say, 3 months with low skies and no sunshine and only darkness. 3 months with no sunshine, low skies and only darkness. And notice how that speaks to your state, what the experience of that is like. Right. And now you might invite the clouds to part and some sunshine to break through, and that feeling of the sun coming on your face, and be with that and in your image for a moment, and notice what, if anything, shifts. And I'm curious how that was for you. What did you notice from those little experiments?
I definitely noticed physical responses. I could feel my almost like my face screwed up a bit at the sharpness of the lemon, And definitely the thought of 3 months without the sun, I felt it's like my posture was contracting a little, and then just imagining the sun, I felt like it was coming up, and I felt a smile coming to my face. There's definitely a physical response that I was aware of because it was an exercise. So therefore, by condensing down the reaction to a thought into a small exercise, you became very aware of it. And I was just now reflecting on it with you and thinking that, this must be happening all the time in our lives, but because there's so much going on, we're not observing it in the way that in the context of a coaching exercise, and when it's sort of brought to our awareness in that way, we suddenly do think, oh yes, this is purely a thought, and yet I'm noticing how my whole body is responding.
Yeah. And so part of it feels like a bit of a sense of a mission I'm on in life is kind of decolonizing this idea of the imagination as being only in our brain. And kind of dismantling this idea of our thoughts being in our head. Because in actual fact, the response, like the experiential response, is inseparable from the imaginative input.
Yeah.
We are a whole being process. We are a whole being in process, and that whole response is full of information. And so similarly, when a client comes with an inquiry to a session, their whole being is alive to the material in a similar way to, more complex way, but a similar way to how our whole being responds to the invitation to think of biting into a lemon or, so that that they're bringing to the session is threaded through their whole experience, and that's an embodied reality. So part of what we're doing from a somatic perspective is inviting in, supporting a client to bring that alive at the beginning of the session for themselves, and we might use some invitations to help them arrive at what the felt sense of that is, that thing that they're exploring. And then the tool that we work with emerges out of the needs of the inquiry, like a regular coaching session. And the invitation or the exploration will be in order for the coachee to touch in on their material from a different perspective, to sort of support them to find different ways in, perhaps, or different ways of approaching, or depending on what their inquiry is. But the interventions that happen in that middle section might look a little different in a somatic coaching session.
Okay.
Am I being a little abstract still?
I'm really interested to build on the experience a little bit, and hopefully listeners will have tried that experiment and reflect on their own experience.
I'd love to hear what their experience was as well.
If you are listening on the podcast app, please do leave a comment and share your experiences, or share your experiences on the website, because I think that would be brilliant to have this as a more of a dialogue with listeners. On the practical side, I'm just thinking, so in that little exercise, you almost used the mind and the imagination, which triggered a physical response. And then I'm hearing you talking about, experience isn't just in the brain, which I think is very common, and I sort of fell into that trap myself. And I'm thinking, so how does it work the other way around? How does our body affect our thinking? Because if our thinking can affect what our body does, presumably, things that are happening to our bodies affect our thinking, and we might not be aware of it. Is that something that comes up in coaching, or that you've come across?
Yeah, absolutely. So we might call that a bottom-up approach. So we're kind of working from the body. And just to bring something to life, might you be curious to follow another little experiment with me?
I would love to follow another experiment. Yes, and of course invite listeners, unless you're driving or otherwise operating machinery, please do join us in this little experiment.
Oh, okay. So I'm curious, if you were to bring something that you're sitting with, you don't need to tell me what it is. I don't need to hear your content.
Okay.
But if you were to bring something up into your awareness that felt like it might be about a 3 or 4 out of 10 in terms of like slightly irritating. So 10 being really frustrating and 1 being almost invisible to you, something that's slightly annoying you. And just let me know when you've found that.
Yeah, I've found something.
Okay. And if there was somewhere in your body, something in your body that might know something about that feeling of slight irritation, what might that be like? Like if you turn your awareness a little bit inward for a moment and just get a little curious, take a little bit of time with that question, something in your body that might know something about that experience of slight frustration.
It feels like as soon as I came up with it, I felt like it was just behind my heart. And it was like that kind of, this is audio podcast, it almost like just felt like a little bit of irritating, a little bit scratchy kind of sensation. But it was almost in my back, so my sort of mid-back behind my heart. So not my heart, but sort of behind my heart. It just felt like a bit scratchy. Yeah.
So if a sensation behind your heart that's a little bit scratchy, and I'm seeing you, just for those that are listening, Felicity's doing a little, how would you describe that? Like a little running motion with your hands? Like
just a little, they're restless, restless. They're not peaceful. They're just a bit restless, yeah.
And if you were to go into that little sensation behind your heart in the middle of your back that's a little bit scratchy, is there anything else you can see or sense in it?
It's almost like having become aware of it and talked about it, it's starting to ease a little. I feel it's almost like starting to ease off a little. And I think bringing the awareness to it has almost helped, because it feels like rather than, it's made a difference already. I think just bringing the little bit of awareness to that physical sensation. And if I think about the issue, which was a little niggle that happened this morning, it doesn't feel as important.
So bringing awareness to the scratchy thing, and these territories of experience in our body do emerge and change. They're very rarely fixed. So bringing your awareness to it, you notice that it changed, and then in coming back to your inquiry, there's a sense of, how did you describe it?
It's like it's not so important anymore. It's like softened in the body, and it just feels like it's not as important. It was
lovely.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and we might go, what we might have been able to do, there's all sorts of places we could take that, but we could have got curious about whether that place had something to tell you, or whether it had a voice, the place behind your heart. And if it wanted to let you know something, what might that be? And if it's doing a job, what job it's doing, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
So those kinds of questions that help you get clearer on the nature of the thing. And then, of course, come back to the inquiry at the start and notice how you're sitting with that now. And then another thing do you want to do another one?
Yeah.
Or should we sit with that one for a moment?
I think, this is making me think of sort of bringing up something that for me, it's this way we have a sort of sensation or something happens, and then we start thinking about it. And when we get into that kind of loop of going round and round in our mind, and almost like having that dialogue with ourselves and talking about it, and, this is really irritating, whatever, that doesn't take us anywhere. But when we come back and let that go and come back to the sensation, so this is something that's absolutely fascinating. And it's that link just between the minds and the body, and understanding that our thoughts aren't really real. They sort of get triggered by something, and then we kind of talk and we make that something mean something, and we get stuck in it. And somehow coming back to a sensation and just giving that a little bit of attention. And maybe if it had been a stronger thing I chosen, like a 5 or a 6, I might have needed your other questions. But once we come back to that sensation and just work on that, almost like we can let go of the dialogue, the narrative that we're giving ourselves. Yeah, the story.
Yeah, and that, just to sort of give that a neuroscience frame, I am not a neuroscientist, let me just put that front and centre. But from my limited understanding of brain's function, we have this executive function, this meaning-making function that is the most modern part of our brain as humans. And it's very influential in how we think of ourselves as a self, this rational, meaning-making, logical, critical part of our perception. And what you just described there is you've invited yourself into a primary experience of the quality of the thing, and come into presence with that, this feeling behind your heart. And then the secondary experience, which is the meaning-making function, can come second. So we're giving attention to the primary experience, and then the secondary experience comes second. It's not better or worse. It's just in order of happening. So first we have an experience and then we make sense of it, right? That's the order of how learning happens.
Yeah.
So it's kind of reverse engineering that. It's kind of, let's come back to the experience. There it is behind my heart. And hello, the thoughts had a chance to rest. It's like the thought train. It can kind of soften for a moment. For me, it's beautiful as a coach because I don't always need to know all about your content even. Yeah. I can support you with the felt sense and you can do the meaning making as the coachee later or at the end of the session maybe.
Yeah. And sometimes I think there's a risk in coaching that, clients just, sort of get into this story or, maybe it's an old story. And of course, sometimes it's useful to come up with a new story and narrative. But I think it can sometimes be useful to take that step back and think all of this is just story in a way. What's actually going to help us feel calm? Because at the end of the day, what normally helps us in, say, an interaction or in communication or connection or some of the areas that I'm interested in is actually being present and not just being present with what is rather than getting lost in what we're telling ourselves about it. And that fascinates me. And that's why I think, learning how to connect with our bodies and release tension in our bodies can help us to be more present. And it's like understanding ourselves better, but not having to always make sense of it with a story. It's like, okay, this happened and maybe I was feeling this. And is this making sense? So for me, it is about, I always try and reconnect to the body. And if I'm having a difficult conversation, I feel myself going in and out of it. I get caught up in the story and I think, remember to come back to the body. And then I'll get caught up in it again. Yeah. So to me, it's always about coming back to the body is the power and recognizing how things feel in our body.
Yes, and there's something we can get into about making thinking wrong or making certain experiences that we're judging as unfavorable as wrong. And a somatic frame might be, what if it's information? So what if it's doing a job and it's full of information? So how might we orient towards it? And like you just did there with your sensation, turn towards it, say hello and offer it the dignity of awareness, I see you. Hello, I see you. And you're doing a job. Yeah. My overactive thoughts. Hello again. I think when we make something wrong, it can make the thing fight harder for its survival.
Yeah. I mean, I very much don't think about making it wrong. So I think one of the things I talk about in my book is this observing self and this idea from acceptance and commitment therapy. And this idea that there is parts of ourselves that can observe our thinking. And you can observe it with compassion. You're not judging it, but you're just not getting caught up in it. So it's not about arguing. It's very much about arguing or making it wrong. It's about observing it as for what it is, which is thinking or meaning making or sense making or something like this.
Yeah, I love that. Observing it for what it is. And you just saying that brings up this beautiful quote, that the really kind of foundational quote in the school. Nathan Blair, who founded the school, is really kind of woven this quote from Carl Rogers into the body of the course. You probably know it, that the curious paradox is that when I can accept myself just as I am, then I can change.
Yeah.
And there's something about what you said there that really reminds me of that. That's kind of the business we're in, right? As coaches.
Yeah. And I think so many people are going around with shoulds and judgments and, all this sort of stuff. I'm not good enough, or this isn't good enough, and things like this. And being able to observe that for what it is and find different ways of working with the body or working with our perceptions or so many different tools. I think that's really valuable because all these shoulds, people are carrying it around. And I don't know about you, but I do hear all the time these sort of people are being hard on themselves, harder than they need to be. And finding, as you say, that lovely quote from Carl Rogers, that acceptance. And I love that.
Yeah, I'm still working on it myself.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, obviously at the end, I will invite you to share where people can learn more about you and your work if people want to explore this area. But thinking about a listener who is new or relatively new to working with the body and somatics, and obviously it's an area where people want to be working safely. We don't want to be triggering trauma in our clients, but nor do we want to be, I think, scared of working with the body in a way that could be safe or could be helpful or could honour that whole embodied intelligence. So what are some of the maybe ideas or shifts? You've shared a couple of lovely exercises, but, how might a coach start to bring some of this thinking into the way they work?
Well, just as you were speaking then on this theme of consent, something that came up in me was this idea of the difference maybe between verbal consent and somatic consent. So what might that be interesting to unpick a little bit?
Yes, please.
Dive into? Yes. We're pretty obsessed as a culture at the moment. We're pretty right on with verbal consent. It's a bit of a thing, isn't it? We need someone to say yes, and that allows us to proceed with the work that we've agreed to do. If we were to put a somatic lens on that, we want to be feeling into the field, feeling into the third, and from a place of a settled nervous system as the coach. So I'm in a place of resource, I'm feeling into the third. And when you're saying yes, I'm sensing, feeling, sensing, perceiving. It'd be good if there was a word that meant feeling, sensing, perceiving. It's a bit hard to... Yes, it has a resonance. And it's very difficult to describe what I mean by resonance, because resonance is an experience, right? So we're looking for a yes that has a resonance, and that means that the system of the client is on board with their yes. So we want to be listening for a yes that has the support of the client's nervous system. And sometimes a yes can be putting the cart before the horse. Sometimes a yes can sound like a yes, but not feel like a yes. And we're interested in yeses that feel like a yes, because then there's resonance. So it's just a slightly deeper cut to just maybe simple verbal consent. We're inquiring with more of ourselves, maybe, when we're asking that question, how is that for you? That's one thing that came up just as you were speaking then. And because in coaching we're present moment and forward focused, where something that Nathan Blair says at the school, he says, if it's not resonant, it's not right. And I love that in the sense of the coaching container. So if something's coming up, it doesn't mean it always has to be positive, but if the client can't be in their agency in how they're coming towards their material, then the tool, we need to go somewhere else. As the coach, we need to sort of invite them. There needs to be some resonance and some ability to work with the material. And a red flag for me, just in terms of this trauma-informed piece that you were asking, a red flag for me might be whenever a client's agency can't come with them somewhere, that's like, okay, step, but then we dial it back. We don't go there.
Right. And can you say a little more what you mean about agency and that phrase?
So agency is creativity, resourcefulness and wholeness, so their choicefulness. So we want to be able to bring our creativity, resourcefulness and wholeness to the coaching container as the coach, but we're also holding our client in an atmosphere of the assumption of you are creative, resourceful and whole.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, if we're following a client where they want to go and sensing that there might be an edge there for them in something they're approaching, we invite in their choicefulness in relation to the edge, like we bring the edge into awareness maybe and support them to be in their choicefulness with that edge. And if they meet a place in themselves that doesn't feel like they want to continue, we honour that and we go somewhere else. Or we support them to feel supported in a different way. We go a different way around and we're checking in. We're constantly recontracting.
Yeah.
If it's not feeling like it's in service, right? And our job is not trauma therapy. So sometimes at the beginning of contracting, or I might make it clear on my website, say if I'm a somatic coach, that this is not a replacement for, but might work nicely in conjunction with, we're goal-focused, present moment and future-focused, rather than digging into the past necessarily. So sometimes I find in a session, because the somatic coaching is relatively new for a lot of people, I might say, I'm curious if it might be helpful for me to just take my coach hat off for a moment and put on an education hat and just give you a little bit of background here about what we're doing. Yeah. Might that be helpful? And for some people, that's really settling. They really love that. And even though it's not classically coaching, it can help support people because we've lived in a very disembodied way for a long time culturally. So it can help people to learn about the fight, flight, freeze, collapse responses, or what the sort of basic biochemistry of those places are. What I mean by certain phrases, like what does resource mean? I use that word a lot, but what do I mean? And always this idea that your experience is queen or king. Your experience is queen or king and sovereign, and part of contracting might be if at any point that doesn't feel the case, then we need to recontract.
Yeah, that's really interesting and clear. And I think it's for all types of coaching, but that importance of good contracting and recontracting, and that sense of you might draw a client's awareness to something, but it's an invitation. Do they wish to go further? Is this right for them? And I also agree that sometimes, including with permission, an education piece can be really helpful. Some people are happy to just jump in and try something, but it's partly that sense of safety as well. It's answering that question, why are we doing this? And maybe it's satisfying the more, that more cognitive side, as well. So,
of course. And that's like for some clients that really needs to be met. It's longing to be met. That place really wants to be met. So let's meet it. Let's say hello and give it a chance to be in the room as well.
So thinking about a little bit so far, we've talked obviously about the way everything's embodied, that cognition's embodied, and in the culture that we live in, this hasn't always been the case. So there's a growing awareness of it, and the importance of perhaps coaches recognising whether this is something that they want to make integral to the work, or perhaps whether something that they just want to be aware of. The importance of working with respect, with awareness of our own role as a coach, that we're not a therapist, but that bringing this in can add another dimension to what we do. And something I would be really interested in. The first one is just, I've summarised a little bit of my understanding. I'd love a little bit of your summary of maybe a few key takeaways for coaches who might have been interested in some of the ideas discussed. And I know we've gone from practical exercises through to some of the more, the more
conceptual
ideas. So just to bring it back to perhaps a few thoughts for a listener to take away about somatics in coaching, about embodied intelligence. So a few.
What comes up in me as you say that is that we're already working with the embodied condition, whether we think we are or not.
Yes.
And whether we know it or not, we're already working with the embodied condition as coaches. So it's part of what we're already doing. It's not like something that needs fixing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, because here we already are in a body.
Yeah.
We already are feeling, sensing with a beating heart and all of the feelings that go with that. I don't know about takeaways other than follow your curiosity and follow your interest as a coach. Like if the tools that I work with in my practice have kind of emerged from playing with clients, like following my curiosity. So one tool that emerged, which is working with small objects. I actually did a masterclass for you guys for the Association of Coaching using this tool. So this tool of working with small objects emerged out of, I was working with a client who struggled to imagine in. She found it difficult to picture in. And so I thought, maybe she could imagine out. So I explored how it was for her to make the small objects her it.
Oh.
So often with somatics, we're self-in-presencing, where like the I, like you said, the witness in relationship to their it, and their it might be the scratchy behind the heart. But equally, I could have invited you to imagine that the slightly irritating thing was represented by this. I'm holding my headphone case in my hand, for the listeners. I might have invited you to imagine, how might it be to imagine that the slightly irritating thing that you're working with is represented by this thing you're holding in your hand, this small object. And what do you notice? Oh, I notice it's solid, it's restless. I don't know, there might be all sorts of things that you notice, and you can do the same thing. So what's it got to say to you? What does it want you to know? What's important? How might it be to put it down? Now what's it like? You can take it anywhere. You can also work with space around clients. So, for example, a client came wanting to work with transitions. She was like wanting to move from full-time employment into self-employment, and she was feeling a lot of fear, and she knew she needed to do it for her happiness, but she couldn't work out the next right step. And I thought, transitions, what's in her space that could represent a transition? And I saw a doorway, and I thought, curious how it might be for you to, are you up for trying a little experiment? Yeah, great. And she went and stood. I invited her to go and stand in the doorway and invited her to imagine that the job that she was in at the moment was behind her and the new direction was in front of her. And what did she notice? And followed it from there, just followed her there. So the discovery that, oh, gosh, in fact, I am in this transition. I'm not fully in this old way. I'm in here. I'm further ahead than I realised. Yeah. And then we just followed it wherever she wanted to go from there. So finding metaphors in the physical environment that are suggested from the client's inquiry, and then turning that into a physical experiment so that perception can flow and movement can happen with the material. They're just a couple of examples that come into my head that I think are kind of low-hanging fruit.
I thought that was really good, actually, the idea that you use the space around you, and as well as just what's inside your body, but you're also moving your body in a way that reflects metaphorically the situation you're in. Super powerful.
The idea of body language, and in somatics we might call it gesture rather than body language, but there was something here that was happening with your hands as you were talking, and I might try that on as the coach just to feel how that is and invite you to notice what that's like for yourself. And is there anything there? And it's like a flower opening. Oh, it's something to do with discovery, or who knows, So there's that very sort of intuitive mirroring thing that helps build rapport, and very much would be part of, I imagine, what a lot of the listeners' practice already incorporates.
Yeah.
And just sort of identifying that is actually an embodied tool,
Absolutely.
It's not so far away. It's not actually a whole different landscape.
Yeah. Absolutely.
How's that land?
That's wonderful. I've trained in clean language and symbolic modelling, and one of the things we use a lot is the awareness of gesture and helping a client. We've got an episode on this as well, helping the client to identify metaphor, but one that might come out of their embodied experience. So it's a slightly, subtly different approach to metaphor to the one you were describing, where you might use an object. And
absolutely embodied. That's an embodied tool. We can't really avoid it. I feel like the more I get into this work, the more I realise we can't avoid it, because it's the condition of being alive. So it's more a deepening and a broadening than a totally different subject area, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, during this conversation, I'm sort of thinking this is so integrated that probably people are doing it already, even if they haven't put that word on it. But also just recognising how important it is. And as you were saying, it doesn't have to be going inside all the time. It can be going outside. It's whenever you use movement, whenever you use anything, I'm thinking that isn't just words, you're bringing in, or maybe even when you're using words.
Yeah, and even with words. So even with words, I notice when we're talking now, you're sharing, and there's a sense of excitement I'm getting from your sharing. There's a brightness in your face and an expressiveness in your being. And I'm wondering how that is. What's that experience like for you? So even like words have somatic resonance.
So that's
so juicy.
An interesting sort of point to draw the conclusion. I mean, we've touched on integration from the very start, but I'd love to just a few more thoughts as my final interview question for you, to think, in your world, what does integration mean for you?
I love that. I love that question. It's a question I feel like I need to go away and digest more. It's an ongoing inquiry for me. So I like to think of integration in the work I do as a little bit more like metabolizing or digestion. So sometimes I find, because I'm interested in the territory of neuroplastic change, I find that when change is happening at that level inside people's system, then the integration process can be kind of practical, like let's get that date in the calendar for the 20th of September so we don't fall over it, let's write that email on Monday or whatever. It might be kind of really kind of pragmatic like that. And sometimes it can be more like, oh, I really just need to have a nap or I feel a little weepy, I'm just going to have a little cry and then rinse that through. One of my teachers, Lisa Schwartz, says it's just neurons firing. It's just neurons firing. So sometimes it can be almost like, when you have a massage and for 24, 48 hours after a massage, you just feel a little bit different. It's like something coming through the whole system. You might need to drink a lot of water and have a lie down or something. Sometimes you might feel like going for a run. Sometimes you might feel some anger might be moving through your system. And the invitation is to not let the story get stuck on that, but just let that rinse through.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just, I'm going to go for a walk with my project represented by this object. I'm going to put my project in my pocket and I'm going to go for a walk or something, And as ever, like in the work that we're doing, we're always supporting the client to come to their own resonant sense of what integration feels good for them. I'm not laying that on them. That's coming, that'll be theirs to tend to, and my job to support them to tend to it at the end of the session in the way that feels resonant for them.
Yeah. So I love to use some embodied words there, like metabolizing and digesting, and some really great ideas, and also that important message that how we integrate needs to be resonant for ourselves, for our clients, for the individual. There's no one way that we do that process. I mean, I was thinking the importance of, when you sleep, when you go to sleep and somehow in the morning your brain has integrated material without you having to sort of keep it in your conscious mind, but your brain has done the work. So that was the method that just arose for me when you were sharing. So thank you for that.
I love that. And I love the invitation that we might be completely surprised by what arrives, So I had a client the other day. I said, what might you need to do to integrate this learning? What might you like to do? She goes, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to plant an oak tree. And I went, oh, okay, great. I mean, there's just no way I could have predicted that was going to come up for her, but great.
Wow. Oh, a fantastic story. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and appreciated all your ideas and stories. If listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, what do they need to know? Where do they need to go? Just a bit of time for you to share anything you'd like to about yourself and your work.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you, Felicity. It's felt really collegiate and fun. My private practice is vibrantbody.co.uk, and that's one-on-one work, but it's also I teach online course. I teach embodiment to not just coaches, embodied intelligence to the general public in online courses, and that's vibrantbody.co.uk. And the Somatic school, which I've referenced a lot, which is where I teach coaches to work with embodied intelligence, that's the somaticschool.com. I think that might do, like 2 is a lot. That'll do. 2 websites. I've got others, but that'll do for now.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I do encourage you, if you're listening to this and you're interested, to check out a bit more about Rachel and her work, because it's such a fascinating area. You're probably doing it already. And could you be doing more? Could you be learning more? And if you're a little bit curious, then do follow that curiosity. So thank you very much, Rachel.
You're welcome, Felicity. I love that invitation. Follow your curiosity. What a nice note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our new digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop and increase your coaching expertise.